This is a CBSN Pittsburgh special presentation.
Welcome to another edition of Around the Table Politics 2021. I'm Stacy Schmidt. This is where we talk about some issues that are facing the country and the local regions as well, and we do it from a political perspective. And there's a lot to talk about. So I would like now to introduce our panelists as they are here every week. And we're going to start with former governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Corbett. He is a Republican, and he also served as state attorney general and the U.S. attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. He teaches law now at Duquesne University. On the other side of the table is the former chairman of the Democratic State Party of Pennsylvania, Jim Byrne. Jim also served as chairman of the Allegheny County Council and as mayor of Millvale. Jim is an attorney in Pittsburgh. Back to the Republican side of the table, we find Keith Schmidt. Keith's political background is strong and dates back to 1980 in the Reagan campaign. Keith was state director for former Republican Senator Rick Santorum here in Pennsylvania, and he was also an advisor to Santorum's 2012 presidential campaign. Keith has his own consulting firm now here in Pittsburgh. He's had it for a decade. Now we turn to the great philosopher of Around the Table, Joe Mistig. Joe is a familiar name in Democratic politics around the state. He's had several roles in city government for Pittsburgh and also served as a deputy mayor for the city of Pittsburgh. Joe teaches law at Duquesne University, and you can also read his weekly column on politics and on life in the Trib. So, gentlemen, all of you, thank you for joining us. And let's start this way. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the gasoline tax. Now it's back in the news again. Governor Wolf says he wants to phase out the gasoline tax and look to find some other means to try to fund the infrastructure in the state. PennDOT has indicated the state is now billions of dollars short of what it needs to be able to handle what needs to be done. There are some options, but let us begin this discussion with Governor Tom Corbett, because it was under Governor Corbett that the state enacted the highest gasoline tax in the country. Governor, your thoughts about wanting to change that?
Well, let's not talk about the tax for a moment. Let's go there. Let's go to this spot. Nothing is free. Highways are not free. You have to repair highways on a regular basis. And it's not just Pennsylvania, it's in every state. And we need to start taking a look at where we're going in the future. And notice Joe nodding his head when we talked about what are we going to do with electric cars? How are we going to raise revenue? I don't use the tax word. How do you raise revenue? And we need a lot of revenue. We needed the revenue to repair the bridges, the 600 some bridges that we started doing. We need revenue on the turnpike. We need revenue not only for PennDOT, but the local municipalities. They need revenue. How are we spending transportation dollars? We spend transportation dollars for many different things other than just roads, but we also spend it on the Pennsylvania State Police. So I understand that he wants to create a commission, which I do not think is a bad idea. I probably was going to go down that road in a second term. And clearly this is a second term issue, because you're not going to make anybody happy as a governor when you start talking about this. But you need to reach out and get partners in the legislature, really, in my opinion, before you announce this one. Because as soon as you announce it, everybody starts taking shots at it. There has to be a consensus that we need to find a new source or new way of obtaining the revenue that is needed. I understand that people are upset with what it costs at the gas tank, and I understand that they look at it as a tax, but they're not thinking about a tax when they're driving down the road. Other states do other things. I know Virginia used to have an annual tax on the value of your car. And if you had a nice car, your tax was higher. If you had a junker, obviously your tax was lower. Is that something that we could do? I'm sure Joe and Jim and Keith also have some thoughts on how do we gain the revenue? That's where this debate ought to be discussed.
Joe, I'm going to turn to you because you seem, when we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that things need to be changed, and you're worried about the electric vehicles.
Sure, this is a major issue coming down the road at us, no pun intended. And it's not just state roads and federal highways that depend upon the gasoline tax for their improvement and constant updating. You know, every local community gets a share of the liquid fuels tax. When we don't have that anymore, your local roads are likely to fall apart as well. So this is an issue that affects us right around home. Most of the local borough and township budgets look to this tax in order to keep their infrastructure up to speed. The governor's correct that this is a second term proposal for a governor who's not looking at reelection. Well, to his credit, he brought this up in his first term and had some political problems as a result. But it was part of an historic infrastructure improvement plan that we could have not done without and could have never achieved without that gas increase. So electric cars are going to impact this a lot. If people aren't buying gasoline, how do we get the drivers of electric cars to pay their fair share, to pay for their fair share of the roads that they're using on a regular basis? And we're wrestling with that now. Like many things in society, we have to find new ways to do them.
There's talk about a vehicle miles traveled tax. Jim Byrne, this tax would benefit the roads by using a proxy. It captures road use independent of a vehicle's economy. So your thoughts on which way maybe we need to go in Pennsylvania?
There are always possibilities. If we step back and look at the tactical rollout of this announcement to do away with the gas tax and replace it with another type of tax or source of revenue, you have to question the tactic with which this was introduced to the Commonwealth. I agree with the governor. This should have been something that the governor and his team reached out to individuals in the House and others where they would need support and start to get an idea of what they may have in mind if this were to be explored, instead of hitting them the way they seem to have been hit / blindsided with the announcement. When you do it that way, the first reaction, knee-jerk, is going to be more often than not critical. Had there been more communication prior to the announcement, it may not have been as critically received as it has been so far. But that's been par for the course for this administration. So looking back to answer your question on this alternative option, anything is possible. If you are going to replace this revenue stream with another, you have to have some assurances that it's going to be as adequate or hopefully better than what you're replacing. I agree with what you said and what the other panelists have said about looking in other states for other templates on how they handle their infrastructure issues. The models from Virginia seem to be a very good place to start. But why not reach out to your colleagues in other governor mansions across the United States and see what they're doing or how they're doing versus what we do here now. And then when you put this commission together, look comprehensively at those other ideas and ways of doing things. And perhaps you can take the best from each and make a national standard right here in Pennsylvania.
All right, Keith, you can wrap this one up. Your thoughts?
Well, I always talk about margin calls. At some point, there's going to be a margin call. Well, this is one of those examples. States and the federal government through the years, it always seems like public pensions and roads and bridges and big spending items always gets pushed back and pushed back and pushed back until it becomes a crisis. And arguably now we're at that point where tough decisions have to be made by our elected officials, and they have to come together in a bipartisan way to get it done. When I was looking at some research to prepare for today's program, I saw the federal excise tax on fuel hasn't been raised since 1993, and it stopped paying for itself in 2008. We're spending more money than it brings in for the last 14 years. And now the governor is talking about a commission, and everyone says, well, let's hear about it. Let's talk about it. But there's a big gap to fill there. I mean, if he takes away the gas tax, the number is $6.9 billion. And that's a number that puts everybody on their heels. But if you really want to be put on your heels, look at what the PA Department of Transportation tell you what the real number is on expenses needed to get us up to date. $15 billion, more than 2 times the 6.9 that we'd have to replace in the budget. So the time has come to make this decision. I hope it's on a bipartisan basis. And listen, we elect our representatives to go to the Capitol in both Washington and Harrisburg to get the job done. And the same thing we do with presidents and governors. Stop talking about it, focus, and get it done.
Stacy, can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
It's not just incumbent upon the governor to do this. The leadership of both parties in both houses, they could sit down. I know it's unusual. They could sit down and say, we've got a problem coming. We're going to be doing this the same way every year. We got a problem coming. Let's take responsibility. Let's put together our own working group, or let's get a commission with the governor and do this together. And we're not going to fix it in a year or two. Give it a 4 or 5, maybe an 8-year time frame, because decisions are always made now at the last minute. And the one thing in the back of every member's mind is reelection. You got to turn this over and let this become a long-term thing that can be accomplished in a much more comprehensive and maybe an easier way.
Stacy, if I may, when the tax was raised during the Corbett administration, with the cooperation of both chambers and both caucuses of the state legislature, it also managed to garner labor support and business support. There were still some reluctant politicians. This is a hot potato for a legislator who's up every 2 years, obviously. But when you start closing down the bridges in that legislator's district, or you start telling the business people, the community, you're going to close down those bridges, they come around. And if that's what it takes, I mean, that's what it takes. But this has to be a comprehensive effort. This is an all hands on deck kind of problem.
Yeah, and we're at a point where it's a safety issue. Every week you drive around Pennsylvania and there's another bridge that changed the weight requirement or closed entirely. I mean, God forbid that there's a news story at some point that something tragic happens because we kicked this can down the road so long. Let's get to it.
Jim, I have to ask you this, given what the governor just said, is that possible given the way we are, the state of politics right now, where you can't seem to get Republicans and Democrats even in the same room?
The closer you get to the ground, the closer you get to a politician who has to look out his or her window across the yard into the window of his neighbor's house, who's eyeballing him right back, the more you see some pragmatism and some bipartisanship.
Okay.
The mayor of Millville, the issues we did weren't partisan. You wanted your street paved, you wanted your bridges open. I got elected my first term in large part because the prior administration couldn't get the North Avenue Frederick Street Bridge open. So they didn't care what party I was. And then when you get to the county council, some of the best legislation I had down there was bipartisan legislation with Jan Ray, Vince Gascab, Ed Kress. We did some good things together. In Harrisburg, I think, is the next necessary step. This is an issue that you can find bipartisanship at the Commonwealth level, because these folks are going back home and they are answering to their neighbors directly. You get to Washington, you start to see more of a disconnect. That's a separate conversation. That we don't have that type of toxicity here that you see in the Beltway.
Okay, Joe, I'm going to ask you the one final question here, because you're the only one that resides in the city. Should bicyclists pay a tax for using the roads?
Everybody who uses the road should pay a tax. Everybody. Now, I'm not sure how you do that. There are practical problems with some of these becoming more favored modes of transportation. But if you're using the roads, it's unfair to others if you're using them for free.
All right, I had to get.
I'm not sure how much those 8 bicycles will fund the project.
Well, they have exclusive use of a lane on Penn Avenue downtown. So,
and if they need it, I have a list of who they are.
It's right outside my window. I'm looking out at Penn Avenue right now. I've
There it
seen
is.
one bike in the last.
How many
8 months.
bicycles you see there, Jim?
One since Labor Day, I think.
The most bicycles I've seen are drawn on the road.
Oh, good. I'm glad I brought this one up. All right. We just talked to Jim. You just mentioned this, that the toxicity perhaps in the Harrisburg is not quite as bad as it is in Washington, D.C. There's talk from the Biden administration of raising taxes. How well do you think this one will go over?
Well, they couldn't get one Republican to vote for a stimulus bill that Americans were screaming for. Again, the closer you get to Washington, the more partisan things become. The issues we just discussed at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania level are the type that you can achieve bipartisanship. But even in Harrisburg, it's not what it needs to be. But the issue we talked about is one that you can find common ground. Washington, if the Republicans say the sun rises in the east, Democrats are going to object. Well, what time of year is it? If it's summer, it's the north. They can't agree on anything. when you saw how not one Republican, not one, voted for that stimulus package, not one voted to put money in people's pockets, not one stood up to and voted for a bill that was similar to bills that Democrats voted for in the prior administration, you appreciate the unfortunate level that it has become. So now, parlay that into your question, I don't expect you're going to see one Republican agree on that. And you may even see some Democrats, especially like you mentioned in the last segment, who are legislators up every 2 years with a 5 Democrat advantage. You can see some folks on the Democratic side balking at this as well. So no, don't expect any Republican support, and look for some Democrats to walk this back as well.
So let me add this. I think one area that you could get some bipartisanship is going back to what we've been talking about, is infrastructure. We desperately need infrastructure, not just the highways, but the dams and the bridges, the ports. Everybody needs infrastructure right now. And I'm somewhat surprised that in addition to COVID, one of the first things that the president didn't do was ask the leadership on both sides to come in, sit down and say, well, we want to talk about infrastructure. Are you willing to participate in that discussion? Not here's the plan. Can we discuss that? It would be an olive leaf in the very beginning, or olive branch, I should say, in the very beginning, but I think it can open some dialogue. They need something that they can open some dialogue, that they're not adamantly opposed to each other. And I think, there are extremes on both sides that wouldn't be there, but I think there are a lot of people in the middle that would be there to talk about it, and they can talk about it. And if they pass something, if they do it the right way, I don't think they're going to suffer the consequences of not getting reelected.
Infrastructure is a win all across the board. It's a win for everybody. Labor, business, the average working family, the communities. It's lasting improvement. FDR found that magic formula back with the WPA, and it has served us well ever since.
Keith.
Well, when you spend like drunken sailors, you have to talk about raising taxes. But the timing couldn't be any worse than coming out of a pandemic when people are hurting all across America. And quite frankly, I'll stand up and with my Republican brethren who did not cast a vote for that bill. I believe people were hurting. All the people on this call believe people were hurting and needed help. But the bill, $1.9 trillion bill, went beyond that. It spent over a third of that money on expenditures that weren't going to be spent till 2022 or after. We did not need to spend that now. And a little over $400 billion had nothing to do with stimulus or nothing to do with the pandemic. So that bill was more of an $800 billion bill and not a $1.9 trillion bill. And when you spend $1.9 trillion, then you have to start finding ways to pay for it. But I can tell you, it's going to be met with bipartisan opposition if this administration tries to tax America back to prosperity.
And that was the answer. That was the question I answered. A tax for the sake of a tax, and I agree with Keith. But what the governor said, an infrastructure bill, America's needed its own Marshall. Yeah, America's needed its own Marshall Plan since the Marshall Plan. And Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi, the personalities were just in such conflict. They tried to talk about it, but they couldn't get anything done. But I think President Biden, with his relationships in the Senate and his history of working in the Senate, this is a conversation, like the governor said, that could have been had right out of the gate, but needs to be had sooner rather than later.
All right. The Democrats also have something called H.R. 1, which part of it would make a change in how the elections for president and Congress and Senate would be held, and it would take place across the country. Otherwise, in other words, in some ways, it would be federalizing elections. Keith, your thoughts about this?
Well, I've been talking about this for a long time. I have not read or seen the coverage yet on H.R. 1, so I'm not going to talk about the specifics of that legislation, but I can tell you on merit, the fact of a federal law for elections is something I thought we have to consider. I was at an event last evening at the Duquesne Club, and without even starting the conversation, I came into a group of 6 or 8 people, and that was their discussion. Their discussion was the real crisis in America is the confidence in the election system when there were questions in 2016 and questions in 2020. We don't want people to be so miffed by the election process that they don't participate anymore. And I suggested that federal elections for president, senator, and Congress, I think there is reason to believe that how you kind of vote in Rhode Island should be the same as California, Texas, Alabama, et cetera, if it's a federal election. And if this bill talks about that, talks about the same dates, the same requirements, the same counting, the same ballots, then it's going to see this Republican supporting it.
Silence.
I can talk a little about HR 1. It's the John R. Lewis voting rights bill. Doesn't have a chance of getting past the filibuster in the Senate. Not a chance. And we may see other reforms that have perhaps a better chance of making it through. They may even require some tweaks to the current state of the filibuster, which, I don't know too many Democrats that would object to that at this stage. But HR 1's not going to make it. Now, it does call for some national reform. It does call for some national standards. We have some of those now. The states are not permitted to violate any of your rights based on your religion, your race, your heritage, your gender, anything of that sort. So we have some standards from the federal government that apply to national elections and to local elections in that regard. And we have some that apply specifically to national elections. If we're ready to do this, we have to be ready to pay for it. If you want to talk about a big bill, how do we get new and consistent voting apparatus throughout the nation in every polling place? I don't like that because I think it makes you an easier target for the hackers. I think there's something to be said for the disorganization we have because we're a moving target in many ways, and I think that's helpful. The experts will tell you that if you want to hack our election, you have to go to 50 different states, and how many counties they have, you have to get in there too. And I think that's part of our strength.
The further into the weeds you get at the federal level on infrastructure, the further you get into compliance and subdivisions and some parts of legislation, the thinner the ice gets on constitutional issues as they relate to the states managing election issues. So you have to really, the further into the weeds you get on this, the thinner the ice, the more likely you're going to not survive a constitutional challenge. And as a professor said, correctly so, it's good to have this compartmentalization that we have in the way we do it now. I served for a couple of years on the U.S. Elections Commission. I was appointed there by Congressman Brady out of Philadelphia, and we would have briefings every 3 or 4 months. And sure, they were trying. The Russians, the Chinese, pick a nemesis. They were trying, but the fact that we are so compartmentalized makes it impossible to systemically come into this country and crash our election system. As the professor said, you'd have to go into 50 states. They want to come to Pennsylvania, pick one of the 67 counties. Now you're in Allegheny County, pick one of the municipalities, pick one of the 32 city wards, and then get into one of the specific precincts. So that type of micro structure that we have in place is in many ways a safeguard from the type of nonsense that you can expect from our adversaries.
I would think if we're going down this road, and I don't think we're going to get very far down this road, and if there was really a desire to do it rather than just make political points, there would have again been a discussion beforehand that can we come up with some guidelines to apply to the states? And the absentee ballot, the mail-in ballots and something like that, that might be one guideline, that there's some consistency between the 50 states and the territories. Right now, there's not consistency between the territories and the states. I doubt there's even consistency between the counties in Pennsylvania on that. On a federal election, here are the guidelines. The election day is on this day. It goes from 7 to 8. Absentee ballots, they can be requested at a certain time. If you can bring that down, rather than trying to do everything in one big fell swoop, you might have a possibility. I don't think that's going to happen, though.
I agree with you, Governor, and I agree with my Democratic colleagues. I think I have no problem with different machines in every state. I just think we can collectively decide on what the rules are, what time they open, what type of ballots can be used, when can they get those ballots, when do they start counting those ballots. All that type of ruling should be consistent everywhere in America, so the outcome is more trusted and secure than it has been in the last decade. But if they want to use different ways to vote, different machines because of the fraud analysis, I'm not going to stand in the way. But I think we have to have a consistency on how the rules are administered in all 50 states.
All right, I want to move on to something else here. I wanted to get into the filibuster, but we'll do that for another time because we are beginning to run out of time. But let's stay with the election for a moment. Obviously, the Republicans gained some seats in the House, but lost the Senate and lost the presidency. And there's now talk of whether the president will be running again in 2024, whether he won't, where things are going to stand in 2022. Keith, where does the Republican Party stand at this point?
Well, all this talk about the concern of where we're going. I mean, listen, I've seen since the revolution of 1994, 27 years ago, the pendulum swing back and forth, and they think there's dire straits for both parties. And within an election cycle or two, they're back in power. So I really think the two-party system is working and very healthy. And as far as the Republican Party, they need a message. They just can't be Dr. No. They have to talk about what they would do if given the mantle of power again. But let's remember where the Republican Party stands right now. I understand we lost a hotly contested election for the presidency, but the Senate chamber is equally split. We gained 8 seats this last time in the House, are now projected to be in a position to possibly take the House in the midterm elections. 27 of the 50 governors are Republican. 61 legislative chambers in America are Republican. 37 are Democrat. So as far as the health of the Republican Party at the grassroots level, at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level, it's way too soon to put up a panic flag. I think we're in a great position as long as we seek out a good leaders and a consistent message that the American people can embrace.
I'm going to agree with Keith on that. If you look at history, both parties have seen highs and both parties have seen lows. If you look at the election of Lyndon Johnson versus Barry Goldwater, when he just crushed Barry Goldwater, the pundits, the media said that's the end of the Republican Party. Well, it certainly wasn't the end of the Republican Party, and Richard Nixon won the next time out. Who would have thought that Richard Nixon would have won at that period of time after having lost in 1960 to John Kennedy?
And lost the governorship of California.
I'm sorry?
And lost the race for the governorship of California.
Absolutely.
62.
So when you see that, we're trying to take a snippet in time and say what's going to apply from now and forever. It's not going to do that way. Why? Because people change, people retire in office, they lose in office, issues come about that cause us to vote a different way. The one thing that is consistent about politics is its inconsistency. It's constantly moving among the parties and among the people.
Joe.
I agree with Keith and the governor. I think our two-party system is very much alive, very active. Nobody promised us pretty. I mean, it's not pretty, but it's working. To paraphrase Mark Twain, the rumors of the death of our political parties, of both of them, have been greatly exaggerated. We were all on the ropes. Both parties are on the ropes at various times throughout modern history, and yes, sometimes the bell rings, you rest for a while in your corner, and you come back out fighting. It just, the pendulum swings, as Keith said.
All right, Jim. Apparently, the Republicans are not waving a white flag and surrendering.
Well, they shouldn't, but I've never seen them on the ropes like this. There's a couple variables that are different this time than we've seen in the past, even like, back and you talk about these examples from Richard Nixon, et cetera. There is a wing of that party, the QAnon wing, whatever you want to call it, the Proud Boy wing, whatever you want to call it, the insurrectionist wing, whatever you want to call it. They don't represent traditional GOP. They don't stand for what the Republican Party stands for, conservative values. They do not. They stand for a cult of personality. They stormed the Capitol. They're being arrested every day because of their conduct and because of the venom that they spat and because of the former president who enabled it, in my opinion. They have split the GOP. Now Donald Trump is sending announcements out saying, don't give to the Republicans on my name, give to my PAC. They are looking for candidates to run from that cult of personality wing. They're attacking. I hear Trump supporters saying that Mitch McConnell has to go. I've never seen members of the party going after its leaders the way I've seen it. So 30,000, 40,000 members of the Republican Party, rank and file voters across the country, have left the GOP in the last 2 months since the insurrection. So no, I haven't seen anything like that before. Having said all that, I think the party needs to regain its identity back to these traditional, less government, conservative principles, conservative issues, conservative candidates, and not some of the radicalization that we've seen from the congresswomen from Colorado and the one from down in Georgia. So if they can get back to those type of roots, and I think inevitably they will, but right now they're far away from where they need to be.
Keith, you agree?
I mean, we're almost 2 years away from the midterm. I said what I said. I'm not panicking. There is certainly a schism, but that schism has plenty of time to heal. If you don't think there's major factions within the Democratic Party, well, then you're crazy. I mean, every party has to deal with a wing that they're not completely comfortable with. You know, I'm not a member of any organized party. I'm a Democrat was the joke for many years. So I get that. But I'm saying there's such a runway between now and November of 2022. There's plenty of time to heal. And I think the infrastructure from the county level, the state level, and the federal level is still there for the Republicans to move forward.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Politics 2021 and Around the Table. And we'll talk again soon, and maybe we'll bring up the filibuster at that time. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy.
Bye.
Take care.
This has been a CBSN Pittsburgh special presentation. We now return to our scheduled programming in progress.